For years now, even though the Liberal government in Ottawa has had the barest of representation in our province, they've been imposing their destructive agenda on Alberta taxpayers. We see this as Alberta Liberals enacting policies that will devastate our province's economy.
Not only is the federal government neglecting the rest of Alberta, they've made funding arrangements with other provinces for housing. In fact, around the same time, in February, I believe it was the day apart, the federal minister rolled into Edmonton, made a $175 million commitment. The very next day, he went next door to our good neighbor, British Columbia, with a very similar population base and made a $2 billion promise. Let that sink in. We're getting a bad deal.
Section 92 of the Constitution states that municipalities fall within the exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces. The terms could not be more clear or more certain. And yet, as we've come to see far too often, the federal government extends itself too far and interferes in our provincial jurisdiction. And we aren't the only province to see this and be troubled by it. Last November, during our Council of the Federation meeting in Halifax, premiers across the country were united in opposing Ottawa's practice of stepping over our provincial governments to make agreements directly with municipalities. So today, this is no longer just talk in Alberta. Today, we are taking back more of our jurisdictional control and telling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet that they cannot make deals without our express approval. And this afternoon, I'm pleased to table the Provincial Priorities Act to do just that. For much of our recent history, Albertans have paid far more in federal taxes than we get back in federal programs and transfers. Even during the last economic downturn, one of the worst in our history, we were still the largest net contributor to federal finances. And yet we consistently receive less than our provincial neighbours in per capita funding. And when we do receive funding, those federal dollars come with ideological strings attached, offering funding on its own terms, bypassing the provinces, and forcing municipalities to dance to Ottawa's tune, like funding for so-called safe supply or electric buses that don't work. When what we really need is envelope funding to expand existing provincial programs that already exist in these areas. Funding for what Alberta's priorities are that we need. Federal interference, we don't. Ottawa should be staying in its own lane. The way we see it, federal and provincial funding should be spent collaboratively, not at cross purposes. And it should be spent on Alberta's priorities and not on Ottawa's, because after all, a lot of that money came from hardworking Alberta taxpayers in the first place. But this federal government has never let reality get in the way of a good headline and never missed an opportunity to grab more control from the provinces. Our government believes Albertans are entitled to their fair share of federal funding and to have that funding spent on priorities that matter to them. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that happens, including through this legislation, which signals that Alberta will act to ensure the Constitution's integrity and that we won't put up with any further manipulation or political interference from Ottawa.